There are losses that seem to close entire chapters, yet sometimes they only begin stories we do not yet understand. When something we love is taken away, the soul learns the weight of silence, and emptiness finds its own voice. There are days when all that remains is the echo of a why that finds no answer, and it is in that broken space that God begins to work, not to return what was lost, but to reveal what can still bloom. Restoration does not always begin when things fall back into place, but in the moment the heart decides to stop fighting what can no longer be changed. God does not rebuild in haste, He plants in the ruins. And while we stare at what was lost, He shapes in the unseen what will one day become testimony. Pain is not punishment, it is fertile ground where grace grows its deepest roots. Maybe you believed the end was final, that after so much waiting, after so much effort, what was lost would never return. But God never calls it an ending when He still intends to use it. Some losses are pruning, and some silences are soil. What seemed like reduction was preparation. What looked like absence was the unseen being remade. God does not erase scars. He turns them into marks of passage. What was once a wound becomes a path, and what was ashes becomes seed. The same God who saw Job among the ashes still sees you today, not with pity, but with purpose. He knows what was taken, and He also knows what is being born. God's restoration is not a simple return. It is a quiet, almost imperceptible process where the unseen begins to align with the eternal. When you think nothing is happening, the roots are taking hold. When you believe everything has stopped, heaven is preparing movement. The timing of restoration is not the clock's time. It is the time of surrender. God is never in a hurry, yet He is never late. He does not work to the sound of our urgency, but to the rhythm of what is perfect. Some things only bloom after winter, and some hearts only beat again after they have learned to rest. And when grace finally arrives, it does not return what was, it creates something new in its place. That is why true restoration does not sound like return. It carries the fragrance of beginning again, because what God restores never comes back the same. It comes back stronger, purer, and filled with purpose. There are losses that shake the ground beneath us and silence the soul. Moments when everything that once felt secure falls apart, and the heart struggles to understand how to move forward without what seemed indispensable. When something precious is taken away, it is not only the object of loss that hurts, it is the echo of what will never return. And time seems to pause between what once was and what will never be again. But the Bible tells the story of Job, a man who lost everything he had, his children, his wealth, his health, and his peace. Even in the dust and ashes he did not stop praying. And the text says, "And the Lord restored the fortunes of Job when he prayed for his friends, and the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before." Job 42:10. Restoration did not begin when everything was returned, but when Job's heart turned toward God in the midst of his pain. True faith is not measured by how much we understand, but by how long we remain. When the ground breaks, trust must learn to walk on ruins. Perhaps what hurts you the most is not what you lost, but the feeling that the ending is final. Yet the same God who allowed the silence is the one who knows how to turn ashes into testimony. Loss has a way of revealing what truly sustained the heart. Sometimes it was success, sometimes a relationship, or perhaps the illusion of control we held on to. When everything breaks, God shows what still stands. It was in the desert that Moses heard the voice that called him by name, and it was among the ruins that Job discovered God still speaks. Suffering is never the end of the story. It is the stage where grace learns to reveal itself. While the heart mourns what is gone, God is already writing what cannot yet be seen. The tears that fall today may become the seeds of the next season. because there are promises that only sprout when the soil has been watered by pain. You may ask, why did God allow this to happen? There is no simple answer, but there is a certainty. The heavens did not go silent by accident, and nothing was lost beyond his reach. Even when everything seems out of order, God remains in command of the unseen. Job's story did not end in loss, and neither does yours. Something is being prepared while you try to understand. Faith does not erase grief. It prevents grief from erasing faith. And when the heart finally chooses to rest, the impossible begins to move. What once seemed like the end to God was always the beginning of something new. And it is at that point that the soil of pain becomes the birthplace of restoration. Pain has a silent way of preparing the ground. It breaks pride, removes excess, and makes us look inward. In the midst of loss, the heart becomes soil, and what once seemed barren begins to turn into fertile ground. God does not plant in untouched places. He sows in ruins, because only there is enough space for something new to be born. The psalmist wrote, "Those who sow in tears shall reap with shouts of joy. He who goes out weeping, bearing the seed for sowing, shall come home with shouts of joy, bringing his sheaves with him." Psalm 126, 5-6. The promise is clear. Tears are never wasted. Every drop that falls before God becomes fertilizer for hope. That is why he never rushes the harvest. He waits for the roots to grow deep before the fruit appears. There are pains that do not ask for answers. They ask for purpose. When everything collapses, the soul learns to listen to the sound of what truly matters. God does not waste losses. He uses them as instruments of refinement. Just as gold is purified by fire, the heart is also shaped in the heat of surrender. Looking at what was lost can bring despair, but looking at who God is brings rest. The story of Joseph reminds us of this truth. He was betrayed, sold, forgotten, yet in every stage the ground of pain was being prepared for purpose. What seemed like injustice was actually the seed of a future salvation for many. This is how God works. He plants promises where man only sees dust. Loss, as cruel as it may seem, can be the prelude to a beginning that still has no shape. While the heart grieves what was taken, heaven is cultivating what will come. The same field covered in ashes today may soon bloom with something that gives life. The problem is that we often want to escape the soil of pain. We try to skip the process, avoid the winter, rebuild what was torn down, but every spiritual hurry steals the depth of the harvest. God knows what he is doing, and when he plants, it is because he has already seen the season of fruitfulness. So if right now the ground seems dry and nothing is blooming, don't be deceived. There are seeds being watered by grace itself. The tears of today may be the promise of tomorrow's joy. And when the time comes, you will see that the soil of pain was never the end. It was the place where God began everything again. God's silence is one of the hardest places to dwell. It makes time feel slower and the soul heavier. When heaven does not respond, the heart wonders if it has been forgotten. But silence is not absence. It is method. God does not speak to fill the void. He speaks to form. And when he grows quiet, it is because he is building something that noise would not yet allow us to understand. The prophet Isaiah revealed this mystery. "For thus says the Lord God, the Holy One of Israel, in returning and rest you shall be saved. In quietness and in trust shall be your strength. But you are unwilling." Isaiah 30:15. It is in stillness and in trust that the soul regains its strength. Silence, rather than punishment, is an invitation to remain. There are processes that can only happen when everything seems still. While the heart cries out for signs, God works in the unseen, aligning details the eyes cannot yet perceive. It is like the seed buried beneath the soil. No one sees it, but inside, life is already beginning to sprout. What seems like inactivity is often spiritual gestation. The disciples also knew this silence. After the crucifixion, everything seemed lost. The body of Jesus lay in the tomb, and heaven spoke no word. But the third day came, and the silence revealed its purpose. Not every silence is absence. Sometimes it is simply the interval between pain and miracle. God does not need to explain every waiting. He only asks for trust, and that trust is tested on the days when the heart has prayed all it can, yet heaven remains still. In those moments, what He desires is not our performance, but our perseverance. To remain steady when there are no applause and no answers, believing He is still in control. The silence of God also heals the noise within. It is in the space between words that faith matures. When there are no new instructions, obedience to His last word becomes the greatest act of faith. And that is where reconstruction begins, not with sound, but with trust. So if heaven seems quiet, remember, God has not stopped speaking. He has simply changed His tone. Silence is the language of preparation. And when the appointed time arrives, what is silenced today will become testimony, living proof that the unseen was always working on behalf of those who wait on Him. Restoration never happens while the heart is still fighting to understand or control. God does not heal hearts in motion. He waits until resistance fades. The soul that is tired of trying to fix what it cannot is the one closest to being healed, because surrender is not giving up. It is the precise point where pride dissolves and grace begins to move. The psalmist described it perfectly. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. O God, you will not despise. Psalm 51:17. God never rejects the heart that bows before Him. What the world calls weakness, heaven recognizes as strength. Restoration begins on the ground, not at the top, for it is there that dependence becomes real. Surrender changes the atmosphere within. What was once restlessness turns into rest. Prayer stops being a desperate plea and becomes a quiet breath of trust. It was this way with David, who found peace only when he stopped fighting his guilt and yielded to mercy. He discovered that God's forgiveness is faster than the weight of remorse. Surrender is letting go of the need to understand why and beginning to trust for what purpose. What seems like an interruption is often an intervention. God closes doors not to punish, but to protect. And while the soul still mourns what was lost, He is already preparing what is coming next. There is a kind of strength that is born only when we stop resisting. When control falls, faith grows. It is in that moment that the presence of God stops being just an idea and becomes a shelter. And the soul that once lived in conflict finally finds rest in the arms of peace. Surrender is the doorway through which restoration enters. The heart that kneels is the same one that will rise again. And when the why turns into your will be done, heaven begins to align what once seemed impossible. Healing begins when the soul says, "Enough, I trust you." Maybe this is your moment to stop fighting, to let God be the potter and you, only the clay. If these words are finding you where the silence feels heavy, maybe it's because He's calling you to begin again. If this reflection is meeting you where you are welcome to stay with us. Subscribe and let these quiet words find you again. There are repairs that God makes in silence, without noise, without witnesses. While you try to understand what went wrong, He is already aligning what will one day bloom again. His work happens in the underground of the soul, where human hands cannot reach. And that is why, so often, it seems that nothing is changing, when in truth, the invisible is under full construction. The psalmist described this process tenderly. "I waited patiently for the Lord. He turned to me and heard my cry. He lifted me out of the slimy pit, out of the mud and mire. He set my feet on a rock and gave me a firm place to stand." Psalm 41:2. The miracle did not begin when David came out of the pit, but when he chose to wait. God was already leaning toward him before he even noticed. Faith matures when we learn to trust what we cannot see. God's unseen work is a constant construction site. Every silence carries purpose, and every delay hides a layer of care. The time that feels empty is, in fact, the space where eternity works. What you call a pause, God calls preparation. Remember David. Before the throne, he spent years tending sheep, fleeing enemies, waiting on promises. But it was there, away from every audience, that God was shaping a king. What looked like delay was training, and each silent battle made him more ready for the purpose to come. Maybe you are also in that season where everything feels suspended, dreams paused, prayers unanswered, plans interrupted. But God's invisible work is more real than any visible evidence to the contrary. He is strengthening your roots so that when the wind comes, the trunk will not break. The invisible is the place where God tests trust. If the heart remains firm even without sight, faith becomes mature enough to sustain what is coming. The absence of movement does not mean the absence of meaning. Promises are being woven in the dark, and in due time, the thread of grace will reveal the full design. So while you cannot yet see, keep believing. Silence is not neglect, it is strategy. And when the invisible finally becomes visible, you will understand that every moment of waiting was essential. God never wastes time. He uses it to lay foundations that hurried eyes cannot see. There are moments when the heart, impatient before the silence, tries to rebuild with its own hands what God is still reconstructing in the unseen. It's the impulse of those who cannot bear to wait and believe that haste is the same as faith. But when we try to rush God's timing, we create shortcuts that lead us away from purpose. The restoration that comes from human strength may seem quick, but it never lasts. Isaiah reminds us who truly leads the process. But now, O Lord, you are our Father, we are the clay, and you are potter, and all we are the work of your hand. Isaiah 64:8. The clay does not shape itself, it simply allows itself to be touched. The hurry to fix what is broken prevents the potter from redesigning the vessel according to his will. It is through the slow, patient, divine touch that the right shape reappears. Trying to rebuild alone is trusting your own hands more than God's. It is believing that healing depends on effort when it is actually born from surrender. The cracked vessel that tries to glue itself together only spreads more pieces. But the one who lets himself be carried back to the potter discovers that what seemed like loss is actually the beginning of a new form. Abraham tried to rush the promise and brought forth Ishmael before the appointed time. Moses, impatient, struck the rock instead of speaking to it. Both wanted God's will to fit the rhythm of man. But God does not bless what is born from haste. He blesses what is born from trust. What comes from the flesh demands strength. What comes from the spirit flows in peace. Often, the attempt to rebuild is driven by fear of being alone, of not recovering what was lost, of time passing with nothing happening. But perfect love casts out fear. God does not need your haste, He needs your surrendered heart. True faith does not try to make things happen. It rests in the certainty that what belongs to Him will never be lost. We must remember that grace does not rebuild ruins with the same bricks. What He is doing is something new, and because of that, the old will not fit anymore. Human control is always faith's greatest obstacle, and the surrender that once looked like weakness becomes once again the path to seeing the unseen take form. So before you try to glue together what broke, place the pieces in the potter's hands. He does not simply restore, He recreates. And when the vessel is placed back on the table, you will see that what seemed lost never disappeared. It was simply reshaped to carry something greater. Not every loss is punishment. Some are pruning. God removes not only what hurts, but also what limits. There are moments when He must empty us in order to fill us again, not with the same content, but with something that carries eternal purpose. Emptiness is God's way of making room for the new. Even when it seems that everything is being taken away, heaven is only rearranging what is essential. Jesus used this image when he said, "Every branch in me that does not bear fruit he takes away, and every branch that does bear fruit he prunes, that it may bear more fruit." John 15:2. Pruning is not rejection, it is care. God's shears never touch the branch carelessly, but with love. He cuts the excess, not the value. And what seems like reduction today is, in truth, the beginning of future multiplication. When God empties, it is because he is removing what would hinder growth. It is the same process Gideon experienced when his army was reduced from 32,000 to just 300 men. What seemed like loss was strategy. God did not need numbers. He needed dependence. And with less, Gideon experienced more. The logic of the kingdom is the opposite of human logic. The world says the more you have, the more you win. But God teaches that sometimes it is in the less that he reveals the more. It is in the emptiness that his power becomes most visible. Paul understood this when he heard, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Emptiness is also protection. Some blessings would become burdens if they arrive too early. God knows when the heart is not yet ready for the weight of the promise. That is why he removes what could pull us away from purpose. He closes doors, not out of cruelty, but out of love. What you call loss today may in truth be deliverance. When God empties, he is not ending something. He is adjusting the space for a new beginning. And this process demands trust, for emptiness is not the absence of meaning, it is presence in disguise. It is the interval where the unseen is at work and the visible has not yet understood. So if your life feels reduced right now, do not despair. Pruning is a sign of care. Heaven only cuts what hinders blooming, and when the time is right, you will see that emptiness was the prelude to abundance. God never subtracts without intention. He clears a way to multiply. When everything seems lost, it's hard to imagine that something good could still rise from the ashes. But God is an expert in reversing stories. He doesn't simply give back what time has taken. He turns loss into testimony. What is gone does not return the same, because grace does not restore by copying, it restores by redeeming. Grace recreates, refines, and returns better. The prophet Joel declared this eternal truth. "I will restore to you the years that the swarming locust has eaten, the hopper, the destroyer, and the cutter, my great army which I sent among you." Joel 2:25. God did not promise to return the days, but the years, which means he doesn't just repair the damage, he redefines time itself. Divine restitution is so deep that what once was loss becomes part of the purpose. The promise of restoration is not about material return, it is a spiritual realignment. God does not restore to satisfy nostalgia, but to fulfill destiny. When he restores, the focus is not on what was lost, but on what will be revealed through the new version that emerges after the desert. Job didn't just receive his possessions back, he received a new revelation of who God is. God's restitution is also proportional to the faith cultivated in loss. The deeper the wound, the more fertile the soil for the miracle. The tears you've shed have not been forgotten. Each one is being used to water something that is being born. Grace never wastes pain. It transforms every fall into a step toward growth. Think of Peter, who denied Jesus 3 times and was still restored to lead the church. His failure didn't disqualify him, it simply broke him enough to make room for more grace. That's what God does. He gives back with purpose. What was once guilt becomes ministry, and what was once shame becomes testimony. Divine restitution is not about going back, it's about moving forward with a new heart. When the Holy Spirit breathes over the ashes, even what seemed beyond recovery becomes fertile again. God doesn't rewind time. He makes time work in favor of his plan. Maybe you don't yet see visible signs, but the promise is already in motion. Heaven never forgets what was sown in tears. And if any part of this message is speaking to you, take a deep breath and remember, the same God who promised is faithful to fulfill. If this speaks to your soul, walk with us, one quiet video at a time. There comes a point in the journey when pain stops being just pain and becomes revelation. It's when the heart finally understands that nothing was in vain. What seemed like destruction was only the setting for reconstruction. Faith matures when it stops seeking relief and starts seeking meaning. And in that moment, suffering finds its voice, not to lament, but to teach. The Apostle Paul wrote, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose." Romans 8:28. It's not only the good things that work together, but all things. Even what left, what hurt, what seemed unfair. God uses even the fragments to form something whole. Purpose does not erase pain, it gives it meaning. When the heart understands this, something shifts inside. What once stirred resentment now produces gratitude. What once looked like punishment is now seen as preparation. The soul begins to see God not only in the miracle, but also in the process. And suffering, which once felt like a thief, reveals itself as a teacher. It was the same with Joseph when he looked at the brothers who had betrayed him and said, "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." The revelation of purpose turned trauma into mission. He realized that what had wounded him had also prepared him to sustain others. The pain stopped being memory and became ministry. God turns wounds into tools. No tear falls without direction. Every single one has a destination. When the soul grasps this, the weight becomes lighter and the past ceases to be an enemy. What was once a shadow becomes the backdrop where the light of grace shines brightest. Pain does not disappear. It is redeemed. There are people who still live trapped in the "why did it happen?" when they could be free in the "for what purpose did it happen?" The secret lies in that exchange. Spiritual maturity is not born from control, but from trust. And that trust makes the heart understand that God's purpose is always greater than human pain. So when meaning is finally revealed, what once hurt begins to bloom. The heart does not forget what it lived through, but learns to look at everything with tenderness. Because when God explains the "for what," even what once seemed irreparable becomes a reason for praise. Purpose transforms loss into a new kind of fullness. There comes a moment when the gaze turns back and, for the first time, sees beauty where there were only ashes. God's grace does that. It turns the ground of mourning into a garden. What once seemed like an ending is revealed as a beginning, and what once was weeping becomes song. Grace does not deny what happened, it redefines what remains. And that is how flowers are born among cracked stones. The prophet Isaiah described this miracle with eternal words: "To grant to those who mourn in Zion, to give them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, the garment of praise instead of a faint spirit, that they may be called oaks of righteousness, the planting of the Lord, that he may be glorified." Isaiah 61:3. The promise is not only of comfort, but of transformation. The very ground that once held pain becomes living testimony of God's faithfulness. Grace does not return what was, it creates what never existed before. What was lost may not come back, but something new is born in its place, lighter, wiser, more whole. God's restoration is creative. It does not copy, it renews. He does not patch ruins, he builds beauty upon them. That is what happened with Peter, with David, with Mary Magdalene. All experienced grace at the most fragile point of their stories. And in each of them, failure became the soil where God planted purpose. When grace blooms, guilt gives way to gratitude, and fear turns into testimony. What you call loss today, you may one day call beginning. That's what grace does. It changes the meaning without changing the facts. The past remains the same, but the heart now sees it under a new light. What was once rubble is now foundation. What was ruin is now altar. God never promised a path without falls, but he did promise his presence in every new beginning. And that presence is the true miracle. More than restoring what was lost, he restores who you are. When his love settles where pain once lived, everything that seemed useless gains purpose. And so, among the ruins, grace blooms, silent, steady, eternal. Because no story ends while God is still writing. And if something in you feels broken today, remember, the same God who brought life out of dust is still breathing over what once seemed dead. The cross still stands, and from it life always begins again. Maybe, while listening to these words, something inside you began to move. A distant memory, a pain you thought had fallen asleep, or perhaps just the quiet desire to finally rest. God does not ignore that. Every emotion that surfaces in the middle of listening is his invitation to look again, this time with hope. Because restoration is not a period, it is a path where he walks beside you. Invisible wounds don't disappear overnight. They are healed in silence, layer by layer, until what was once pain becomes tenderness, and slowly the heart learns to rest. It learns that God's love does not erase the past, it redeems it, and his presence is the place where every pain finds meaning. Maybe there are still open scars, unanswered prayers, or heavy memories, but remember, God is still the God who sees what no one else sees. He knows the stories you never told, the tears no one noticed, and he remains, not as a spectator, but as the God who restores, who renews, who remakes. What looks like confusion today will become clarity tomorrow. What still bleeds now will soon be a healed scar. And what is silence now will soon become song. This is how grace works, slowly yet always in perfect time, because true healing doesn't happen on the outside, but within. And when the heart surrenders, heaven finds space to move. So before you leave this video, take a deep breath. What God is rebuilding in silence may be exactly what you've been asking for all along. And when restoration finally reveals itself, it won't return to give back. It will come to transform. You won't be the same, and that is grace. And now I ask you, what has God been restoring in silence within your life? What part of your story is he rewriting without you even noticing? Share a single word in the comments. It might be the hope someone needs today. If this reflection found you in a quiet moment, subscribe and walk with us. May every new message find you wherever grace is at work. Because while the world speaks of loss, here we speak of the God who turns everything into purpose.